Welcome back. I'd like to once again acknowledge the contributions of our sponsors, Iridian Spectral Technologies and Clarion Drone Academy, which are so important to the success of this event. So, gentlemen, thanks again, much appreciated. I'm pleased to now introduce Captain Peter Black, who is MEC Chairman for the First Air Pilots. Peter will moderate our panel on improving airline safety and security. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, both here in the room and also those of you joining us over the webcast. As Dan says, my name is Peter Black. I'm a Boeing 737 captain and also Master Executive Council Chairman of First Air, and also chair ALPA's President's Committee for Remote Operations. It's indeed my pleasure to moderate this afternoon's panel discussion on airline safety and service. We'll be looking at that broad topic from the perspective of the regulator, the air service or navigation service provider, pilots, and airline management. On our panel, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Aaron McCrorie, the Director General of Civil Aviation at Transport Canada. Thank you, Aaron. Along with Aaron, I'm also pleased to introduce Mr. Jeff Cochrane. Jeff is NAV Canada's Director of Navigation and Airspace. Representing the Air Canada Pilots Association, Mr. Captain Ed Bunoza. Ed is the Chairman of the Air Canada Pilots Association Safety Division. And to help give us an additional perspective from the actual airline management vantage, Captain Steve Linthwaite. Steve is the Director of Flight Operations at Jazz Aviation. As I'm sure you're aware, the Airline Pilots Association has been involved in both the industrial and, perhaps more importantly, in the air safety side of the airline business since its founding in 1931. With more than 400 safety and security volunteers and staff, ALPA is the world's largest non-governmental air safety organization. These dedicated volunteers work on behalf of its 52,000 members, as well as the aviation industry and the flying public at large to advocate for improved safety. This year marks ALPA's 85th anniversary, and we're proud to continue this tradition of striving for the highest levels of safety and professionalism in North American aviation. As we've heard today, the aviation industry continues to grow and evolve in ways that were unforeseen just a few years ago. The introduction of satellite-based navigation systems, the precision of aircraft autoflight systems, and the advances recently implemented in airspace surveillance and digital communication have created an entirely new airline operating environment, an environment that leverages both existing and emerging technologies to help raise airline safety and service to unprecedented levels. At the opening of today's conference, we heard Senator Hosako speak directly to the challenges we still continue to face as we all move forward. Of particular interest to me personally are the issues facing transportation in Canada's far north, and the realities that those of us at Northern Airlines face when we attempt to provide regular, viable, and sustainable scheduled air services to remote communities, many of which are only accessible year-round by air. So the future of airline safety and service is the focus of this panel. I have invited each of our panelists to give us a brief overview of how their respective agencies are rising to the challenge that we all face moving forward. To begin, Aaron McCrorie, Transport Canada's Director General of Civil Aviation, will give us his view from the regulator's perspective.
First of all, I'd like to thank you and all your colleagues in ALPA for this opportunity to come and speak about improving aviation safety and from the point of view of the regulator. And it's interesting, this is the third draft of my speaking remarks. I was really grappling with how I wanted to come at this, and my preference is hopefully we're going to get into a conversation or a discussion. So I'm going to throw some ideas out there, and some of them might be a little bit provocative, but just to help generate that discussion. My starting point is that if we're going to talk about improving aviation safety, that's really a shared responsibility. And that seems like a fairly simple statement to make. We'd all agree with that. It's a shared responsibility, and that's a no-brainer. But in terms of understanding that shared responsibility, it's understanding the different pressures and the context that we all operate under. So what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit about the context that we're operating as the regulator, so you can understand our perspective a little bit, and what we're doing to better manage that context so that we can get better at addressing aviation safety issues. So I'm going to briefly touch on three fairly high-level topics. I'm not going to talk about specific regulatory files. I'm sure if you have questions about them, you'll ask them. But I'll use some regulatory files as examples in terms of some of the challenges we're facing or some of the things we're doing to improve what we do. So the three general issues I'll talk about is first of all, what we're doing to modernize how we make regulations. And sometimes not regulating is one of the choices that we're going to make. Talk about trying to be more risk-driven, both in terms of how we regulate, but also when we regulate. And finally, elaborate a little bit more in terms of what I mean by aviation safety being a shared responsibility. The context in which we operate as a government agency is a political context. It's a democratic system. So as a regulator, my job is to provide the best advice I can to the minister, and then the minister will give us directions, and we implement faithfully what the minister asks us to do. And I think that's an important consideration in terms of how we operate with our stakeholder community. It's very important that we engage with stakeholders. I think key to all of our regulatory files is making sure that we have good stakeholder input, but ultimately the decision is made by the minister. We'll provide advice to the minister, but it's the minister that makes the decision. And because it's a democratic system, sometimes that's a little, believe it or not, a little opaque, because you're not going to see what's happening within the bowels of government, nor should you. That's the privilege of the minister. And so often some of the regulatory files we deal with, there's a lot of frustration around what's happening to that file, and we can't necessarily share that with people. And we appreciate that. We also see how long it takes some of our regulatory files to be put in place, and we've got instances where it's taken 10 or 15 years to get regulations in place. And so we've taken a hard look at that and said, how can we get better? How can we change our approach to regulation? So the first issue that I'm going to talk about is how we're going to modernize, or how we're trying to modernize our approach to regulation within Transport Canada. Dan and I have been debating over the last couple of days whether I'd use this analogy or not, but I think I need to use it. I couldn't join you guys last night for your reception because my sister-in-law took me out to make sausages. We went sausage making. And I love sausages, and some of you may or may not like it. It was all fresh, new ingredients. It was a great experience, but it's not the best process. The ingredients were fresh and lovely, but grinding them up and mixing them, it's really ugly. The end result is really nice. And I think that's, to me, what the regulatory process is like. We got some really good ideas and good ingredients that go into it. We put it through a grinder, we mix it up, we grind through it, and then eventually come out with a product that most people would like. But it is messy. And I think the other analogy I'd use is it's not a linear process. I talked a little bit yesterday with some folks about this, where you may file a flight plan, and you're going to go from Ottawa to Toronto, and you're going to have your alternates built into that flight plan. Regulatory processes isn't so linear. It's very iterative. There's a back and forth with it, and a lot of the elements around that are outside of our control. So we need to look at, for those things that are within our control, how can we change how we do regulation? How can we become more efficient? The first thing we're looking at is around governance. There's a limited capacity within the government to do, and so we need to make better choices about where we regulate and how we regulate and what we regulate. So setting directions and making choices, we need to do better at that, and we're making steps in that direction. Another change that we're making is I'm calling it the full life cycle management of a regulatory file. We have far too many regulations that we put out that are not adequately supported by the guidance material for industry to comply with it, or instructions and tools for inspectors to oversee and enforce those regulations. So if we're going to be serious about putting in new regulations, we've got to make sure that not only that we get them published in Canada Gazette Part 2, but they have all the tools that our inspectors need to enforce them and that industry needs to comply with that. Because really, our goal is not a new regulation. Our goal is a change in behavior. Our goal is an improvement into safety. And having a regulation out there that people don't know how to follow is not going to achieve our goals. We need to go look at more life cycle management. A bit of a buzzword, at least in government, and may as well in the private sector, is lean. We've looked at how our processes that we use to develop a regulation within the department, and we put them through a lean exercise. This has come out of Toyota's manufacturing processes, and it applies to government. How can we eliminate unnecessary duplicative steps, steps that aren't necessary, steps that aren't providing value to the regulatory file that we're working on? And so we went through both how, in terms of how we issue exemptions, but also how we develop regulations to lean those processes. It's a work in progress, we're getting better, but my favorite example was a regulatory file that when I first joined civil aviation, spent 18 months trying to get drafting instructions. And there's one of my colleagues who worked on the file, I don't know if he's here anymore, he spent 18 months trying, and it wasn't his fault, he was doing yeoman service. It took 18 months to get drafting instructions approved. That's the first step before we even start drafting the regulations. We introduced the lean process. It took a more nimble approach to doing this. And then the first file to go through that, it took 2 hours to get those drafting instructions improved. I'm not going to suggest that in every file we're going to go from 18 months to 2 hours, but I'm using those two examples to say we can and will get better in terms of how we move some of our files through the system. Instrument selection. If you're a carpenter, you always think you have to use a hammer to solve all your problems. And we tend to, as the regulator, think that we need to solve all of our issues with regulation. But regulation, even if we become much more efficient than we currently are, it's not always the best instrument or the most nimble instrument to address the safety issues that we're dealing with. So and it's not necessarily even the only instrument that you can use, and you need to start looking at using it in conjunction with other tools. So we have some examples, for example, recent Transportation Safety Board reports that have come out recommending that we address unstabilized approaches. Well, we are looking at that from a regulatory point of view, but prior to doing that, we issued a civil aviation safety alert to require operators to look at that as a problem within their industry, within their operation, and take steps, if warranted, to reduce the incidence of it. It's a voluntary approach, and if it achieves our goal of reducing the risk, then we're all better off for it, and it's much quicker than the regulatory approach. So we are looking at instrument selection to say, can we do things quicker? Can we reduce the risk to an acceptable level without regulating? If it doesn't succeed, then we always have that ability to regulate after that. And then getting the right skill sets. And this is a little bit about inside baseball, if you will, in terms of our challenges as a regulator. But it's clear to me that within Transport Canada Civil Aviation, the technical experts that we have are second to none. If they're not world-class, they're just one step below that in every sector that we have. I have no doubt about the technical competency of our staff that are working on regulatory development. But where we struggle sometimes is getting regulatory files through a Government of Canada system that is asking non-technical questions, that are asking questions about social issues, political issues, jurisdictional issues. And that's where we've been weak a little bit. So looking at how do we enhance that capacity so that we can address those non-technical issues that we're really good at, and address those other issues. And what's interesting is I've seen files where nobody debates the technical merit of what's being proposed, but it's about the social and political issues around it. And so we need to get better at looking at those sorts of things. So doing that, I think, is going to help us become more nimble, more effective, at least within the things that we control. There are things inside the regulatory system we have no control about. I don't get to call when there's an election. And when there's an election, I down tools. We don't completely stop working, but our ability to engage with people and ability to move regulatory files stops. And I don't control that. So what we'll do is address what we can't control and become more effective in terms of doing that. And I think I've heard the term, I've tried to be here for most of the day, and I've heard the term risk-based, risk-driven, and I'm going to use that term again. I think key to us doing better as a regulator is being more risk-driven. It's a rapidly changing environment out there from an aviation safety point of view, and you saw Donald Roussel's presentation on unmanned aerial vehicles. That's just one example of how rapidly the industry is changing. And we're faced constantly with competing priorities, and we can't do it all. We have to make some serious choices about what we do and what we don't do. If our mandate is aviation safety, then what we should be looking at first and foremost, it's not the only thing that we look at, but we should be looking first and foremost at what are the aviation safety risks that we think we need to regulate. So that's the first question. What should we regulate? When should we regulate? To that end, last year, as part of our annual business planning process, and we've got a really good business planning process that understands the risks to us as an organization to deliver our mandate, but we never really looked at, believe it or not, what are the risks that we should be addressing as a regulator? And so we did an exercise within the organization to identify, and it's a work in progress, but what we did was to identify what do we consider our top safety risks. We didn't decide should it be 4 or 3 or 7. We just asked the experts in the group to start looking and saying, if we were to define the safety risks that we as the regulator need to address, what are they? And they came up with 4. The first was the approach and landing phases of flight. The second was unmanned aerial vehicles as a sector. The third was loss of control in flight. And the fourth was what we'd call human performance factors. And so that now is going to start driving our work moving forward. As we're looking at our regulatory files, how do they match up against those 4 broad categories? There's more work that needs to be done to validate that and maybe fine-tune those 4 risk areas, but it's actually now giving us, for the first time ever, an ability to look at our 19 different regulatory files and say, how many of them actually match up against those risk areas and which ones don't? There might be other ones on our regulatory list for other reasons, but we need to know that they're on there for a reason other than aviation safety. And so and you may have questions later about some of these files, but if I look at some of our current regulatory files that are in different stages of development, runway and safety areas, well, that speaks directly to the risk of approach and landing. Flight and duty time speaks to the risk around human factors. Approach ban. We're going to start doing some regulatory work around the approach ban. That speaks to, again, approach and landing phases of flight. Trying to find some other examples for you. Crew resource management speaks to the loss of control. So we're starting to see how our regulatory files that we're moving forward now line up against the risks that we think are out there in the system. So that's the what we regulate. I come back to the how, and that's around instrument selection again. Can we effectively mitigate a risk through voluntary means? Do we have to regulate if we reduce the level of risk down to an acceptable level? If we reduce it down to an acceptable level, then let's not regulate. Let's focus our regulatory efforts on other areas that can't be addressed through voluntary means. And then we have to also look at what are the total mix of efforts that go into, or measures that can go into reducing a particular safety risk. So if I look at undershoots and overshoots, we do have a file that we're moving forward on runway and safety areas, but you can't look at that in isolation. You need to look at the other measures that we put in place as a regulator, whether it's updating of TP312, our aerodrome standards and recommended practices, or some of the other operating rules that we have in place that have an impact in terms of reducing the likelihood of there being an undershoot or overshoot event. It's in that totality then we can tell a story about how we've reduced the risk associated with an undershoot or an overshoot. And so rather than trying to solve it all with one single solution, looking at the mix of solutions that help us reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So that's what we're doing as the regulator. But I also want to kind of turn this around and say, and make a tie to safety management systems. We remain committed to safety management systems. We think it's an important part of managing aviation safety. We've regulated it obviously in some sectors, and we will look at regulating in other sectors moving forward. We do need to do some work in terms, if I go back to the life cycle management of a regulation, we need to make sure that when we move SMS into Part 704, 703, for example, 702, we have the right tools for those segments of the industry, and that our inspectors have the right tools to properly oversee. So we need to do that work. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn the challenge around. There's a tendency I see it all the time, of what's the regulator doing to solve the problem? But for those companies that have an SMS, what are they doing to solve the problem? And I've heard Kathy Fox, for example, from the Transportation Safety Board speak to this around the issue of runway and safety areas. That the onus in an SMS environment is as much on the operator to identify, assess, and mitigate their risks. And so as we're moving forward on regulatory files, we're going to also turn around and look to the operating community and say, we're looking at this, but you need to look at it as well through your SMS and understand what the risk is to your particular operation and what are you doing to mitigate those risks. Again, getting them down to an acceptable level. So it's not about just waiting for the regulator to take action. In fact, I think that's the wrong way of going about it. It's about the industry and all parts of that industry accepting that challenge and looking at what can they do as well to address those aviation safety risks.
Aaron, thank you. Up next is Jeff Cochrane, who is NAV Canada's Director of Navigation and Airspace. He'll explain how NAV Canada intends to leverage current and emerging space-based technologies to best enhance both the safety and service aspect of one of the world's truly premier air traffic service providers.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I feel very comfortable sitting here between Aaron, Ed, and Steve. And you'll see as I walk through this, the necessity to make sure all of these pieces come together. Otherwise, we can't deliver the service that is needed and expected. So this presentation is short. It's mostly pictures. And I wanted to just touch on a few of the tasters, if you like, of the different things that we're looking at doing and the things that we are doing to give you an opportunity to ask the questions as part of this interactive forum. So looking at how we look at the component parts to realize the benefits from an air navigation system, we're going to start, obviously, our job is to make sure that that navigation system infrastructure is there. So what's going to be made available? What are the supporting communication, navigation, surveillance, along with the air traffic management issues that are necessary? By available trajectories, what can we build within the confines of what we're regulated under in order to allow you to fly? And when we're looking at complementary practices, that's going to be also those separation standards that we can apply in different airspace or on different routes, the types of things that we can do in order to move within that navigation infrastructure. Obviously linked to that, as Aaron's pointed out, we need to have an enabling regulatory framework to make sure that we can make use of it. What are you as flight crew allowed to do? What are the aircraft certified to do? What are we regulated to do as far as providing separation, whether it's nose to tail on final on an ILS approach or on parallel RNAV routes? Looking at the criteria that we're held to for the design standards for getting into and out of airspace and airports. And then that third part is our customer base. What are they actually equipped to fly? What avionics have they put in their aircraft? And we heard training mentioned earlier today. What are you actually trained and certified to utilize in that aircraft? And that's a key part of it. And I'll just pause on this or expand on this one a little bit. Actually having the training and having the certification to do something is then overlaid on what your standard operating procedures are and how you make use of it. Because we know within the context of the cockpit, there are different flight management systems, and each of them have their own foibles and their own ways of interacting with the charts and the procedures that we put out there. So this training part of it is something that kind of sits in the background and isn't as easily addressed when we're trying to introduce new procedures. So when we start going around this same circle looking at the air navigation system infrastructure, some of the things that we are doing right now, I've been introducing a NavAid modernization across the country, talking about what we plan to do with existing ground-based navigation aids that mostly sit there and radiate, and people just say, oh, that's nice, that creates a waypoint that I use in an area navigation system. But do I need to really tune it and utilize it? So making sure that what we have out there and what you're paying for us to maintain is something that you're utilizing. Critically linked to this is going to be the creation of additional GNSS procedures, that GNSS plan. And I heard reference to concerns over the north. This week we just wrapped up the Northern Air Transport Association meetings, their annual general meetings in Whitehorse, and some of the figures that I had from that meeting over the GNSS plan that I can share with you. Just looking at the RNAV procedures in general, over 2015, we produced an additional 144 procedures, and out of that, 68 LNAV, 23 LNAV VNAV, and 46 LPV. This year so far, we've produced 93 new RNAV procedures, of which they break down to approximately 39 LNAV procedures, 20 LNAV VNAV, and 31 LPV. Out of those, in the north, 68 of those procedures were strictly for areas for northern Canada. We're looking at an inventory that we're still trying to get to of having over 850 LNAV procedures. We currently have over 550 or so out there right now, so there's about 300 to go still. On the LNAV, VNAV, and LPV, looking at another almost 1,000 procedures, of which we are probably only about 250 or so into that mix, and expecting to finish completion of all of those by 2019 timeframe. For the north, we've programmed an additional 115 procedures in next year, another 103 in 2018, and then another 82 in 2019. So that's some of the things that the GNSS plan is looking at doing, but it's important when we're looking at a navigation system that's being modernized that those have to be in place before the conventional nav aids come out. And that's a commitment that I can make as we're moving forward with this, that as we are looking at retiring some of the older ground-based systems, we make sure that there is something there that can make a proper and appropriate air navigation structure that makes a viable opportunity for revenue generation for the airlines. And just before I move off the infrastructure portion, there's a number of other things that are in there, looking at things like the weather aspects, in particular the north. A number of good news stories coming out of the north as far as additional things that are being done. We've got 176 staffed sites that have the human weather observation systems, which now allow you to have 24 access even when the site is not in operation, to get access to wind altimeter and the data you need in order to do an instrument approach. We're looking at expanding that out to 220 more before the end of 2017. Weather cameras, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then there's going to be many thousands of words going across the country. the weather camera program being expanded as well. Just in the last 12 months, 13 new locations across the Arctic and 21 new sites over the last 12 months across the country. So if you click on our website and look at the weather camera sites across the country, you basically see it littered with the sites that are available. So this kind of technology, laser ceilometers to replace helium balloons, all these kinds of things are rolling into that infrastructure as well as the actual nav aids. Enabling regulations. This is probably one of the best success stories, I think, of a cooperative venture between Transport Canada, NAV Canada, and the industry, this CPAT group, the action team. We've seen a number of issues come forward where we've moved regulatory change, I think, quite quickly and in a way that really responds to the necessity for a risk-based approach. Those of you who follow and read the CAPGen and read your aeronautical information circulars will note that as of the end of March 31st, with that AIRAC cycle, there was a significant change. This was a result of the work done through the CPAT. And that change was to allow operators to fly to destination and alternate using GNSS approaches only. This is a first in the world for commercial operations, for all operations to be open to this kind of capability. Now, it was in the US for those that were using space-based augmented systems and were flying as a Part 91 general aviation operation, but this is a first, and it was done in cooperation with the regulator. I think a real bonus there. Customer capabilities, we really are looking at what you're purchasing, what you've installed, making sure that we are leveraging what's been installed in those aircraft. The GNSS equipage obviously ties into our NavAids modernization. Looking at other things such as the required navigation performance authorization required, or RMPAR capabilities, where we're looking at the more precise paths to get you into and out of the mountain areas. We've just issued new procedures for Kelowna, runway 16 and 34. As of the next AIRAC cycle, every runway going into Calgary will have RMPAR procedures attached to their runway ends. Moving these things across the country, looking at how we can utilize these to better manage the capacity at major aerodromes and also provide access to those terrain challenged or airspace challenged airports as well. The last one, the ADS-B equipage, obviously that's a big one because we are invested in Airline and we are looking at being able to have a capability to have surveillance anywhere on the globe, provided that you have ADS-B equipage, and as a secondary, provided that you also have a top-mounted antenna. So this is part of the equipage that we're looking at. It opens up a whole new opportunity for being able to provide service. And anybody that I've talked to, I say I liken this to the internet, and that we really don't know what that capability will fully provide until we start utilizing it. It's one thing to have the instantaneous surveillance of an aircraft position, but this data set also has accelerations in 3 dimensions. It has all sorts of other information that could be utilized and processed. So exciting things there. But sometimes the things that you put forward, how you get there is just as important. This whole change management process and the requirement for consultation, because if we're not consulting and ending up at the right answer, when we produce something and put it out there, it may not be fully utilized. And so we've put forward this change management and consultation process and wrapped it around what we do for performance-based navigation changes to start with. I know that you cannot read this, so hopefully this will expand the bullets as I go. At the top part, from an input perspective, we have working groups that we run every other month via WebEx and Telecon. We have our area operations consultation meetings that each of the flight information regions hold to take input twice a year, and an online portion where you can input a change request into our connection site. If you're not connected to that, let me know. I'll get our folks to make sure you have access to see all the changes. It also lists in that site the 246 tasks that are listed out for this GNSS program to roll out, as well as the RMP program. And of course, any airspace changes that we may undertake. So feeding in, we're trying to make sure that we gather the information, but then feeding into that to the next spot, and that is the decision point where we decide, is this a viable thing to be moving forward, and creation of a document that's going to identify the requirements of what the customers need and what we are going to hold ourselves to for account as producing this thing. So that as we walk through, if it's a new R&P design, we can look back at this document and say, is it meeting the intended objective? And as I go to the next section, you'll see it gets fairly complicated. We'll get together face-to-face, we'll brainstorm, we'll create this document, but we have to make sure that it works with all the FMSs. We have to make sure it works within the airspace. And the bottom one in that box is becoming one of the most challenging aspects, making sure that all of the environmental considerations, specifically noise in residential areas, are addressed. So we have to make sure, and often we will be looking at what are the trade-offs that we are going to make between greenhouse gas reductions, noise impact, efficiency for airlines, complexity for both air crew and air traffic to enable a new operation. So this is where we go through this iterative procedure and make sure that what comes out at the end as a final design that gets approved by both internally, our people can manage the traffic that way, and our customers and other stakeholders can work with that same procedure to make a new procedure design. So that's the kind of process, making sure that we're going to get to the right answer at the end. Just to demonstrate the complexity, I like to use this little graphic because it shows all of the different bits and pieces. When we're trying to get to that airspace change, the big cog there in the wheel, there's so many different pieces that are going to happen in order to make it an eventuality, all the way from what are the technical standards that are within the box that's been put in the airplane, how it's been installed, what are your operating procedures, what is the safety assessment that we have to do, all the way through our design criteria that we are held to account for, and then looking at publishing things through an AIP that can then lead to that change. So there's lots of pieces in the puzzle in order to make it come to fruition. Some of the things that we have to help us in guidance, when we start from the international harmonization, we're looking at ICAO's PBN manual in this case, a global air navigation plan. Then we kind of roll that up into what's Nav Canada's vision of an overall air navigation system plan, which will include the other aspects of the weather services, the communication services, surveillance, as well as the navigation services. And we want to make sure that we specifically share that information through that document you see there with the performance-based navigation operations that's telling you what it is our plan is that has been consulted. So there aren't any surprises. And the state plan for PBN as well, showing that there is complementary regulatory activity that's taking place to make sure that we can get all these things together in order to bring about change. So that was basically a high-level overview of some of the things. Hopefully it entices some activity from the audience to ask questions. And this is certainly a motto that I go by. And of course, you're going to leave the questions to the end. So
Right. Okay. Jeff, thank you very much. Captain Bunoza is next. Ed is the chairman of the safety division within the Air Canada Pilots Association. Ed, over to you.
Peter, Captain Black mentioned and stated previously the focus of this panel is to give an overview on the challenges of safety and the concerns moving forward. Before we do that, maybe it would be prudent to look back at history and see exactly where we came from, how changes were enacted, what we were doing wrong, how we could do better. So we'll go back a bit in history. We won't go back to the Wright brothers, but we'll go back to the 60s. GPWS, Ground Proximity and Warning Systems. It was invented by a Canadian, Donald Bateman. The technology was there. It was proved. During that period, there was a string of accidents. The accidents were all landing accidents. The contributing factor in all of them, controlled flight into terrain. The technology was there, but unfortunately, it was slow to adapt. In 1976, finally, a recommendation came out from safety agencies, the NTSB, the TSB. We recommend you install this inside aircraft. It's not until 1979 till ICAO came along and said, you know what, here are some guidelines. We really, really think you should have GPWS in airplanes. During that period, there's pushback. We see that pushback all the time. It was industry. What did industry say? The installation is going to bankrupt us. We have fragile balance sheets. We just cannot afford this. I remember being a young pilot. Steve and I had jet black hair. The Toronto Maple Leafs were the greatest hockey team on the planet. And I remember ALPA, IFALPA, CALPA, all lobbying for the installation of GPWS, just like we do today. We lobby, we lobby, we lobby. It took nearly 20 years to get the installation of GPWS in airplanes. We'll fast forward a bit, and we'll go up to 1982. There were 4 significant accidents between 1982 and 1992. They were all attributed to ice on the wings of the aircraft. We all remember watching Air Florida on that cold, cold winter day, the helicopters plucking the people out of the Potomac. Reason for that accident was ice on the wings. 5 years later, similar case, no water. It was in Denver, and I believe it was a DC-9. Ice on the wings, contamination. The outcome was not very good. Closer to home, I know Steve, myself, Dan, Brian Shurey, Ian, we lost colleagues in this accident, Air Ontario and Dryden. Cause of the accident? Snow on the wings. 5 years later, we watched it again. We watched it this time in New York LaGuardia, an F-28 in Flushing Bay. All 4 of the accidents were unable to maintain flight after rotation. It was not until the mid-1990s that we see significant change in the way we operate aircraft in respect to contamination on the wings. The accidents were there. We watched it happen. We met a guy named Virgil Mershansky, the commission, and that led us to changes how we operate airplanes. We'll take a second just to look at other enhancements. TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance Systems. That was invented in 1956. Airplanes were colliding in the skies. The warning signs were there. Prolific crashes. There was a DC-7 with a super constellation over the Grand Canyon. Over San Diego, a Boeing 727 with a Cessna 172. And over Central California, a DC-9 collided with a Piper Archer. It was not until 1986 that the FAA mandated the phased-in installation of TCAS. Canada followed slowly, and by 1990, TCAS was in all our aircraft. Once again, the technology was there, the signs were there, but industry was slow to adapt. I remember working at another carrier, and when TCAS was going to be implemented, and the maintenance director telling me how costly this would be. They fought it vehemently. Not a single airline went bankrupt because they had to install TCAS. Not a single airline went bankrupt because they had to install GPWS, but it was always that fight. There was always that fight. It got to the point where, and I'm not picking on the Americans, although there's not a Canadian team playing in the Stanley Cup playoffs, but the Inspector General came along, and he said that the FAA was deemed a tombstone agency. And what a tombstone agency, he goes on to say, is that our safety agency is called a tombstone agency because they wait for a major loss of life before they make a significant change. And we've seen that all through history. GPWS, TCAS, icing on the wings. So let's fast forward into the new millennium, 2009. We're sophisticated now. We have cell phones. Everyone owns a computer. We're data-driven. This should not happen. Buffalo, New York, 2009, perfectly functioning Bombardier Dash 8. It enters an aerodynamic stall. The pilots never recover from the stall. Was there history? Well, guess what was on the NTSB's most wanted list? Fatigue. Fatigue. What did the NTSB attribute to one of the causes of the accident? It was fatigue. Well, they acted quickly this time in the US. Regulations toward flight and duty times based on science. They changed the standard for pilot qualifications. They changed the standards for minimum pilot qualifications and training standards. But it did take a tragedy for something like this to go through. So what are the significant changes moving forward? What is on our radar? What keeps us up at night? Approximately, pretty well every day there's a laser strike. A cockpit is illuminated on a commercial aircraft. What are we doing about it? We still allow these devices, these blue lasers. There's no purpose for these things in society. You and I will never, ever need I don't need a device that's going to light a cigarette across the room. but we continue to sell them. We continue to allow them to be sold readily. There's no reason for them. We've had suggestions of that, put them on the prohibited weapon list. As long as we allow people to buy them, we're going to have this situation. Drone encounters. We heard the minister last night said there were 100 incidents investigated last year. In the US, 620 last year. That's triple the number from the previous year. I don't even want to guess what is going to be this year. ALPA South, I guess I'll call them, is pushing for secondary barriers. This is for passenger safety. This is to protect the cockpit. It's a great device. Does anybody know what it costs to install a secondary barrier? $5,000, $10,000? Very, very cost-effective method. Basically, it's a bar with a strap across it. It's something that we should revisit. We've let the cockpit door situation sit there without having to revalue it. It is time to look at it again. Transport Safety Board in Canada. You have a watch list, a most wanted list. Items there continue to be ignored. The TSB does a great job in Canada. They investigate an accident, they come out with recommendations, and they sit on this list. They are very, very slow to be moved forward. And it's not the TSB, it's just we as a group are not moving things forward quick enough. ICAO has picked up the ball with remote aircraft tracking. Unfortunately, we had to lose the 777 over that. And finally, on my top list, and one of my biggest concerns, is flight and duty times. Canada has the worst flight and duty time regulations in the world. We can't argue that fact. I just got one slide because I didn't want to PowerPoint you to death. Can you just throw that slide up? I was at the ICAO FRMS format in Montreal a couple weeks ago. And it was a fatigue format hosted by ICAO. And there, the regulator of every country was up there speaking. And the one question I got was, where was Canada? Now, I was told they couldn't afford the train travel between Ottawa and Montreal because they had budget constraints and things like that. We are way, way behind in our flight time and duty times. And if you look at that slide, we saw that in the atrium of ICAO. ICAO is the world headquarters for ICAO is in Montreal. And there it says, no country left behind. Well, you know what? Canada has been left behind with flight and duty times. It's ironic that it's in ICAO at the world headquarters. So really, in closing, all I want to say is, we can't let history repeat itself. We can't let tragedy drive regulations. We can't let it happen again. Pilot groups, we have to be proactive. Everyone has to be proactive. And if you just throw up that last, your banner slide, the red one up there, and ALPA, you hit the nail on the head there. It says, time for real change powered by pilots. I'd have only one suggestion. If you put a dash at the end and you put again, time for real change powered by pilots again. Thank you.
And next, to round out this afternoon's panel, we have Captain Steve Linthwaite. Steve is the Vice President of Flight Operations at Jazz Airlines. Steve has also had considerable industrial experience. He was an ALPA pilot representative for the Jazz Master Executive Council. So Steve, give us the view from the airline management perspective.
Thanks very much. I have a very short slide presentation because I'm the last on a Friday afternoon. Wait for it to come up. But I have a food story. We started with a food story, and I'll relate a food story because one of my topics is SMS. For lunch, you noticed there was the beet salad out front. I love beets, but I'm wearing a white shirt, and I knew I was going to go in front of everybody. So I did a quick risk assessment. I made sure I tucked in my napkin. I noticed my pants were dark, so they were good. And sure enough, luckily, I took that mitigation because one of the beets did fall in my lap. But I'm up here, confident. I'm not sweating because I have a big red stain on my shirt right now. Thank you. I think we saw the presentation up there. There we go. So I'm the Vice President of Flight Operations at Jazz Aviation. And I'm also the Ops Manager, the Transport Canada Ops Manager designate. So I think that's important for this discussion we're having here today. So I'm in charge of a safe operation is the best way to describe it. A few topics I'm going to talk about today all came through our SMS system. We're pretty proud of our SMS at Jazz. And being at the ALPA Forum, I have to compliment my ALPA colleagues over the years. Nick Seymour, our Central Air Safety Chairman, he was around when we first implemented SMS, and we wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't for the hard work of Nick as well. Brian was the MEC chairman there, and now Claude. We have a very successful SMS system because we work together, and I think we should all take great pride in that. So it makes my job a lot easier. On the SMS side, my basic message is it's working. Please leave it alone. I have to say, from when it first started, we first became a Phase 4 fully compliant carrier to now. As per SMS, it's all about continuous improvement and culture change, and we continue to see that. You know, basic culture of quality assurance and risk management and non-punitive reporting and auditing all go together, and we continue to evolve from that. I'm not saying it's perfect. We're still learning as we go. Certain managers are better at risk analysis and documenting those things. But I'll give you a simple example that just happened. Recently we had an opportunity for a points abroad work overseas. And we developed a points abroad manual a number of years ago. And it was about 8 years ago anybody looked at it. So we dusted out for points abroad manual quickly. We did a mini risk assessment on that and realized it was out of date. So we had to turn it down. And to compliment the leadership in my company, they're pretty enlightened. I never got any resistance when I said we can't do it, we're not properly equipped. We need to review our points abroad manual, and that's what we're going through right now. So it's working quite well, and it continues to evolve. So I think the kudos to all the parties in that. Lasers, these have been talked about before. I think it's got, obviously, from the discussions here, it's getting adequate attention. But I think we need to move forward with some practical and enforceable legislation. Maybe look to other countries, what they're doing, what's working in that regard, and get moving on that. On drones, I think it's a better news story. It was an excellent presentation, actually, from, I believe it was Mr. Roussel. I think we have practical legislation. We just have to get moving forward, and I think he readily admitted that as well, and maybe we have to do some tweaking along the way. But we have to get moving on that thread as well. Airport infrastructure. This is a big one for Jazz. We operate a number of different aircraft. The equipage discussion for NAV Canada is an important one for us. We have our Dash 8 100s and 300s. They have VNAV. We're all GPS equipped. That goes without saying. But we don't have LPV equipage on the Dash 8. So as we go through that, whereas we have the Q400s coming in well equipped, HGS, which is an incredible safety tool, by the way. If anybody hasn't investigated it, you should. An incredible safety tool. We have LPV capability on it. So we're well equipped with our Q400 fleet that's coming in, and our additional CRJ 900s that are coming in will be similarly equipped. Our current CRJ 705s, which is very same as the CRJ 900, they're HGS equipped in the left seat as well, no vertical nav and no LPV at this point. But that's some of the varied equipage we have. And and that's one of the challenges we have when we go into airports. But I will ask, I think there's excellent communication between NAV Canada and the airlines, and there's certain airports have very good communication between the airlines and have that conversations. But I do say some of our airports need a better conversation, consultation before they do upgrades at their airport, specifically into airport infrastructure, runway lighting, taxiway lighting, approach lighting. We're getting into scenarios now as NAV Canada rightly puts LPV approaches with minimums down to 200 feet in many airports, where that runway may not have high-intensity approach lighting. It's not required to. So you may be putting somebody in a situation where they're down at 200 feet and there's 2 flashing lights at the end of the runway. And think about that, the ILS would never be certified in that regard. We'd put approach lighting in. Once again, we're an SMS airline. Things like technically you don't even have to have that intensity, high intensity approach lighting when you go into an ILS airport, equipped airport. And we recently had a case where the approach lighting was down in one of our airports that we have frequent flights into. We made our own decision to limit to non-precision approach, which to everybody's point earlier, we buy into what Aaron said. It's our responsibility to make those decisions. But in the same way, I think it's everybody's responsibility to make sure all those tools are there, all those lights, the proper lighting, LVOP, RVOP. We continue to have some airports that don't put any focus on getting their proper lighting. We still have follow-me trucks in certain circumstances. And after hours, sometimes those follow-me trucks aren't available and we're canceling flights. So those type of things are important to us because we want to make sure we have regular service, and obviously it goes without saying safe service. We won't operate if it's not safe, so we're looking to increase the regularity of our service. Stabilized approaches. This gets back to the earlier discussion we had about equipage and the varied equipage we have in our fleet. Also, the issue we have is the varied performance within our fleet. Quite honest with you, a stabilized approach in a CRJ 705 or even a Q400 is not the same as a stabilized approach in a Dash 8 100-300. And if we apply the same criterion to all those types, Nav Canada in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver will be screaming at us. Because if we have our Dash 8s approaching at a certain speed at 105 knots inside the marker, you can imagine what that's going to do to the 380s, the 777s, and everybody else in behind. So what we need to do here is we're actively promoting stabilized approaches. We've been refining our aircraft operating manuals as we go along. But we need to work together. All people in the industry need to work together to make sure we're accommodating all the different performances and all the different definitions of stabilized approach, work together and come up with good solutions that maintain high arrival rates into the major airports, but also accommodate the different performance of the airplanes arriving. And the cost prohibitive parts in there as well. We're part of an airline, so we have to make sure everybody fits in. It's part of airline business. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Steve, that's great. Thank you. To start off, if I could, what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask Aaron McCrorie a question, and it might start off a little long-winded here, but I'll try and keep it brief. As we've heard during today, throughout the day, and particularly Mr. Russell's keynote address, UAVs continue to proliferate at an astounding rate in Canada, both Canada and the United States. Many of these systems now are being developed to support commercial operations. And apart from the very real security issues, how do you foresee the integration of the UAV concept within Canada's existing airspace system? Or in other words, how do you foresee the integration of UAVs and airline operations in Canadian skies?
Wow. You know, we're here, and Donald always uses the term disruptive technology. This is disruptive technology, and for us as a regulator, we're not very nimble. What we're grappling with right now is how do we come at this issue of unmanned aerial vehicles? On the one hand, we're trying to regulate a device, an aircraft. On the other hand, we're sometimes regulating activities, and we're haven't quite nailed that down, to be honest with you. If I understand your question, I foresee a future, and I see it happening already in certain instances, where a UAV is just another aircraft. The regulations that are going to be there in terms of the requirements for the pilot, when we go into beyond visual line of sight, the certification requirements for that aircraft, the knowledge requirements, the medicals for the pilot, the operating rules, the maintenance rules, it's just going to be another aircraft. And you see some instances of this already. There's a small operation in southern Manitoba, a fellow who has a flight school. He has fixed-wing aircraft, he has rotorcraft, and he's got UAVs, and he's got his menu. If you want to hire him to do some work, survey work, aerial photography, it's going to cost you this much with the fixed wing, this much with the helicopter, this much with the UAV. In some instances, the fixed-wing aircraft is actually the cheaper alternative, but for him, that's part of his fleet. It's just part of his equipment. And that's where I see it down the road. And if that's what your question is, I see it down the road as just one more aircraft. The challenge that we have now is how do we make that happen for something that, for those of you who know me, I always use my son as an example. He can go to the Max Milk in Orleans, a suburb just east of here, and go to the Max Milk and for $100 buy a UAV, and we're under the approach path for the Rockcliffe Airport. And so that's the challenge that we have is my son's a great kid, but I don't think he really understands what it would mean to fly that above my house as an aircraft is coming into the airport. So that's what we need to deal with. But 10 years down the road from now, I think it's just one more aircraft.
Any questions out there? Sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jason Polidwar with Iridian Spectral Technologies. As manufacturers of laser reflection glasses to help mitigate effects of laser strikes in cockpits, we were invited to participate in an SAE G10T Laser Hazards Committee working group in the US to develop a standard on training and equipment to be used in cockpit to help protect pilots from these laser strikes. Throw it open to anybody on the panel. What's Canada's approach from a regulatory or industrial perspective to laser strike protection for pilots?
Steve, has Jazz looked into that sort of a risk analysis part and come up with any ideas?
No, I'll be honest with you, it's a good question. I think we're getting to the frequency enough now that probably was something we'll want to look at, but there's been nothing that, I guess it's the old pyramid in the SMS system. We have the reports, there's been nothing that's been affected safety, but I think if you go under the SMS, we will eventually, I think, get there. How we mitigate it short term, we haven't done any analysis on that, I'll be quite candid.
All right. Ed, from your...
We've had groups approach us. There are glasses out there. We trialed it with some of our pilots. It lasted a day or two, and they just lost the glasses in the bottom of their bag. It's just difficult to wear them. There is technology out there, and there's a film they can apply to the windscreens. My guess is that industry will say it's too costly, and we'll run down that same gamut again. I think the solution is some way to prohibit the lasers from being readily available, particularly the real strong ones.
Can I add too? I think the real threat isn't the kid in the backyard with their newfound laser. And so I think designing it into windscreens, which is I think what they're talking about doing in the future, may be the way to go. Older aircraft will be grandfathered, but new aircraft, I could see that as a requirement. The glasses, I think, are a short-term solution, possibly, but then you get into compliance issues because like any safety issue, pilots are human beings, and to get them to wear a device all the time, it's very difficult to mandate and get compliance on it. It can be difficult unless it gets to the point where people are seeing the laser strikes all the time. That's just the human nature part of SMS and compliance in any airline.
Peter, I think one of our biggest problems when moving causes forward is we don't timeline anything. If you work for a major corporation, you timeline things. Your executive vice president has to have this solution or this fixed by February 25th. In our industry, we just sort of let it just slide and let it slide. I think we have to set hard dates, hard targets, and assign it to people that, we've got to find a fix for it now, or it's just going to continue to slide.
Okay. Aaron, you said you want to discuss some of these things, so let's open it up.
I think some of the answers have already been given. I don't think there's a single answer to an issue like this. And so we are aware of some of the work that's being done through SAE, but other private enterprises that are looking at film, for example, that we mounted on the windscreens to deflect, and aware of some testing. And if that pans out, then we look at how we make that perhaps regulating and bringing that into place. I think we've done a lot of work around education and awareness. That can only go so far, and I think Steve's kind of pointed to that. We're hitting the limits of that, and there's limits to enforcement because trying to find the person. When we've looked at it, and we are looking at it, really what we're seeing, and Ed's spoken to this, is if you look at, say, I think it's Australia, where they saw a marked decrease in the number of laser strikes was when they banned the lasers. So the challenge then becomes for Transport Canada, I can't ban things under the Aeronautics Act. So I need to, and our commitment actually is to start looking at, is it a prohibited item like a weapon? That's public safety that has the mandate to that. So do we engage public safety on that issue? Or is it a consumer product that you can ban in terms of importing, and that's a Health Canada issue. It really doesn't matter whose it is. It's that we're going to take it upon ourselves to engage our colleagues and the rest of the government to see how we could institute some kind of ban or limitation in terms of bringing these devices in.
Okay. There's another question, sir.
Osama Balar, retired airline captain and now a safety consultant. Two issues that are recently being discussed. One is pilot mental health issues. I don't know if there's any work being done now on this in Canada. And the second one is loss of control in flight. And going back to basics, teaching and training, and if the current recurrent training that's being done, taking care of this, and does the simulator allow for this, and if there's any regulation being done. Thank you.
Thank you. On the one issue there, with as far as the pilot mental health thing, we kind of feel that this probably isn't the correct forum because it's still under study and a lot of things are going on. We do have a prepared statement if required, but certainly we could pick up the other side of things. Who'd like to jump in on answering that question?
On the stabilized approach, it's a focus for industry. It's in our SMS system. It's on the hazards registry for Jazz. You can ask any of our pilots to go into the recurrent training. There's a lot of focus on stabilized approaches. And one of the key things we've been trying to do is not so promote. Part of the stabilized approach is promoting go-around. And we've really put a focus in the last year and a half of promoting go-around. We have the 1,000-foot point if it's IFR, the 500-foot point if it's VFR, and if you're not stabilized at that point, it's go-around. There's no discussion about it. That is how our AOM now reads. So the good news out of that, anecdotally, I wouldn't say it's significant yet, but we're now seeing more and more SMS reports about go-around stating, you know, we went through 1,000 feet, it was IFR, I was 20 knots off speed, I performed a go-around. And that's the biggest cultural change, I think. So there's a real focus on it. It's sort of like the laser issue too. First of all, you have to talk about it in the system, and then that generates more SMS reports, and then what you learn from the SMS reports, you apply and you use that to judge how successful you're being. And also, you have to reinforce that with the training as well, and all three things. I will say HGS is an incredible stabilized approach tool, incredible. So if somebody's looking for something that has an issue with stabilized approaches, I know it's not cheap, but I'm lucky that I have people above me that are enlightened, and like I said, over half of our fleet is HGS equipped in the left seat, and it's a major safety tool for stabilized approaches.
Peter, if I could add as well, in addition to having the infrastructure there so that you can set yourself up for a stabilized approach, and that's having both lateral and vertical guidance. All of the GNSS approaches that we're intending to put out there, where the infrastructure is there will be an LNAV, VNAV line of minima and an LPV line of minima if the infrastructure is available. And this is where I think we need to encourage the airports that have to provide data back to us as a service provider to get them into the game, to make sure that we have the attestation of the airports, the instrumentation is there, whether it's the proper surveys to make these things available so that we can help and build that infrastructure to make that happen too.
Okay. Sir.
Actually, what I had in mind was the high altitude stalls and on simulators, and if the recurrent training and the 6 monthly check that we do, does it allow for this? And with the sophistication of new airplanes, you know, you have to cover all the syllabus, and you find yourself sometimes you don't have the time to do this high altitude stalls. And they are a necessity, as we saw with Air France back in 2009. So if you care to comment, that's what I had in mind.
Once again, our SMS system, we had a couple of incidents on our CRJ 705s when they went into service. The CRJ 705 does not have auto throttle. So you can see that could lead to some low speed cases at high altitude. So out of those instances, we started actually performing high altitude stall training. So we take people up to, I think it was 30 flight level 350, 340, and we show them the initial indications of a stall. For instance, on the CRJ 705, it's a slight buffet. But one of the things people had to learn, because there's a stick shaker and a stick pusher on the CRJ 705, at lower altitudes you have the shaker first, then you have a few seconds, and then the pusher. At high altitude, it's one after the other very quickly. And it's the shock factor in that. So all of our crews, we do that as part of our regular training curriculum. I've done it twice now, and I think 4 years or 3 years. I don't want to give away our training, but we do it on a regular basis. In fact, I just did my enhanced training in loft 3 weeks ago, and that was one of the things we performed. Yeah.
Training always has to be fluid. I remember when I first came off a DC-9, I went on an Airbus. no hand flying. Let the magic do it. Put the autopilot on. Then after that, it's okay. We're relying too much on the automation. Now you got to hand fly it. I think you always got to have that conversation. I think training will always be fluid and it will always be changing. You know, now the theme of the week is loss of airspeed. So we go into simulator and we do it. As long as we have that conversation, I think we're okay with it. AQP is a great way to go through training. You take data and you use that data and you decide where you're going to go forward with it. Where are the pilots weak? We get a bulletin. Where are we weak in the simulator? Go-arounds. Those are always, I know Francois, he's probably watched some pretty wild go-arounds in the back of a simulator there. Pilots struggle with that, and so we focus on that. So I think we have to have that conversation, and you're never going to have that perfect training scenario.
If I can add something just to that, I've done simulator training for many years, and one of the Air France issue that happened, unfortunately, probably brought to light the whole concept of deep stall training and how our pilots, it's something that we are taught from the very beginning how to avoid. And then suddenly it comes upon us and, whoa, what's that? And the training in the past was very prescriptive as far as what the manufacturer wanted you, how you entered the stall phase and how you recovered the stall phase. It was a deliberate action. And for the most part, at the time, going back, simulators that were designed at that time to provide you the ability to do that. Now, the manufacturers, I believe, now are gone to the situation where they can actually simulate correctly a full deep stall, especially at altitude, which is quite a different beast altogether. So I think that there are improvements along that direction, but I would ask Aaron here, is as far as the regulator is concerned, and when they look at training programs to replicate or to try and mitigate the risk of this sort of situation, as you said earlier, it's sort of a complex calculus to get all the players together to be able to get it done. Is that something that is sort of in the process now evolving into a higher level?
I think the short answer is no. I'm not sure if I understand the question, Peter. One of the things, and maybe I'll come at it from a slightly different angle, and I'm thinking of one of the slides that Steve's had up. You're talking about, to Ed's point, the need to be nimble and fluid. And if you're going to ask us to regulate that, it's not going to be nimble and fluid. You need to build, the regulatory requirements need to be such that you can adjust your training programs to deal with the threats that you're confronted with. And if you're looking for, so I'm not sure if I understood the question.
I think that covers it to a certain extent, but I would suggest that probably as we move forward, indeed now, that demonstrations of full stall at altitude, both entry and unintentional entry, and then proper recovery will be something that will, become not just a mandatory part of the training program, but will also probably evolve by the simulator manufacturers as well to make it more and more realistic.
And I guess my comment to that would be, again, more of a general comment in the sense of, and it's a constant struggle in terms of what do we make mandatory. And I've had this conversation with lots of people. Every time we make something mandatory, something else doesn't get trained. And so it's trying to find that appropriate balance. And we want to be careful that in making that training mandatory, that we're not depriving an operator of addressing the other new emerging safety issue that's coming along. So I don't know what I truly don't know what the balance is, but I think it is about trying to find that balance between what are the things that are absolutely essential. But one of the criticisms we get from some on our regulatory framework is we're requiring training on stuff that's pretty basic, stuff that doesn't need to be mandatory anymore. Mm-hmm. So, and I can tell you, whether it's a standard or a regulation, it's not a simple process to change that. So as soon as we make it mandatory, we're putting you into a box that you may not want to be in 2 years.
Can I add, just the gentleman's obviously an expert in it, but one of the big focuses now, as you know, is training pilots. It used to be 20 years ago, you considered a great recovery, stall recovery, or approach to stall recovery was the captain or the pilot first officer kept the nose up, put the power up, and just flew it out. Well, that's totally against what everybody's saying now, right? You break the stall, you get the angle of attack down right away, and then you bring the power up, and there's a lot more focus on that. That's a real change in the last couple of years, out of lessons learned from, like you talked about.
All right, and we've got some participation from the webcaster. We have a texted message. I wonder, Jerry?
We do. ALPA's Airport and Ground Environment Chair texted in this question. Every takeoff and landing happens on a runway. Canada's runways are lacking some of the basic safety features that our neighbors to the south have as a proven safety standard, like runway in safety areas and runway grooving. When will Canada make these items a required standard for its airports and runways?
Well, Aaron?
You can see. Grooving, I don't think we're going to make mandatory. We've looked at it, and I haven't even had thought about it for a while, but I don't think we're going to make grooving mandatory, although we know some airports have done runway grooving. And sometimes, and I'm not the expert on runways, but one of the challenges we have is the environment in Canada. And so I do believe that sometimes the grooving presents particular challenges with icing conditions, for example. Runway and safety areas, we put a lot of time and effort over the last couple of years to do a risk assessment to better understand what are the contributing factors or what are some of the risk factors around why you'd need a runway and safety area. What's interesting about it, we looked at over probably 300 different incidents. There was no obvious contributing factors to, to say you need a RISA under these conditions or under these certain of operating environments. So what we looked at was, okay, so then what was the frequency of RISA incidents? And I think, I'm working from memory, I think it was about 1 in 500,000 passengers are exposed to an incident where RISA would have been a benefit in terms of mitigating the risk, in terms of reducing the consequence. So we're using that as a bit of a baseline to say, okay, so if we want to improve safety when it comes to runway safety and where RISA can be a benefit, let's start looking at things like passenger volume as a bit of our benchmark. So we're probably not going to require RISA at every airport in the country, but we will try to require RISA where we think the biggest safety benefit will be, where the most people who are potentially exposed to a RISA type event can benefit for that. So this is, again, I alluded earlier to the kind of the frustration you may feel sometimes dealing with government is we've made some recommendations to our minister in terms of what we think we need to do for RISA. We're waiting for that direction. As soon as we have that direction, actually originally I think we were scheduled to meet with industry, and when I say industry I mean all stakeholders, next week. We've now deferred it by a week or two, and we're going to bring people into a room and say, here's what we're going to do with RISA. We think that we should have RISA at these airports for these reasons. What do you think? And be completely transparent in terms of how we got there and get people's views on that with a view to regulating. So very much with RISA, we are moving forward with it. The question is going to be more around where are we going to require it. I would note, though, even our initial analysis, many, if not most, of the airports that we think have RISA or need to have RISA probably are pretty close to having it already in terms of the availability of terrain.
Okay. We have a couple of minutes left for questions, so, sir.
Yeah, actually it's for Aaron on the UAV issue. Bruce McPherson, Clarion Drone Academy. You made the comment that drones are a disruptive new technology. Fully agree with you on that. Happens very quickly. It's difficult for an agency to try to keep up with it. You also made the comment that in about 10 years, UAVs will probably fall into the classification of aircraft. I wonder, why will it take 10 years to get us to that point?
Let me correct you. They're aircraft today.
Yes.
My point being is right now, as from a regulatory point of view, we're grappling with how to introduce them into the aviation system. And we're regulating what they do, when they do it, and we're regulating them. But we don't do that with a helicopter. We don't do that with, we regulate an air cargo operation, we regulate a passenger operation. We're right now, from a regulatory point of view, trying to figure out how do we come at this. My point is, down the road, we're not going to treat them as a separate, strange device. We're going to treat them just like every other aircraft. And so, and reflecting a little bit of the debates that we're having around the regulation, but should you, if you have a drone or a UAV, have an operating certificate? Well, no, depends. It depends on what you're doing. Right now, we're debating, should you have the operating certificate because you own a drone? We don't say you need to have an operating certificate because you have an aircraft. We say you need to have an operating certificate because you're carrying people with that aircraft, or you're hauling logs with that aircraft, or you're doing aerial survey under certain circumstances with that aircraft. We need to move away from the device as something unique and different and into an environment where it's just one more aircraft that's on your operating certificate, or not, because you don't need an operating certificate for that
Most of the individuals in the general public don't understand aviation other than going to the airport, getting on the plane, and flying.
Yeah.
All of us here understand aviation to the point that we realize it's about mitigating risk and working with these people that want to use their aircraft. What I might say is that over the last year and a half, the government hasn't done a great job on their marketing in disseminating information on what the individual needs to do with their UAV. Point here is that one of the original comments made some time ago was that there are exemptions. The general public perception now is that the exemptions can be applied, people can do whatever the heck they want, and they use this word exemption all of the time. Most recently, I think it was in February, the National Research Council produced a UAV site selection tool. And it is not an app, it's on their website that has a Google map of Canada. Every registered aerodrome in the country has a little red circle with the 9-kilometer circle placed on top. And when I have brought this to the attention of our Transport Canada inspectors, they don't like it at all. And I realize maybe because Transport didn't produce this. What I might say is to actually help the general public, do away with the exemptions. Don't ever mention them again, outlaw them completely. Tell people to use an app that maybe Transport Canada can actually create and update with registered aerodromes so that before people fly, the only thing they need to know is you need to run the app, where you are physically standing with your GPS, can you fly or not, yes or no. It's that simple. And if you can't fly, here are the things you need to do.
Don't entirely disagree, but, okay, you're going to run out of time. Oh, we ran out of time.
And that was a great comment, and there's, I'm sure, many more. We've spent much more time talking about these various things, and we just scratched the surface, no doubt. We have run out of time. I would like to thank Steve, Ed, Jeff, Aaron
I
for
think there's
taking...
one more comment there, and
Oh,
I think
okay.
Dan was waving at you there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, Suzanne Acton-Gervais, National Airlines Council of Canada. My question is for Mr. McCrorie on the issue of laser illuminations or laser attacks. There's been obviously a lot of discussions and a lot of great work to mitigate these incidents. However, have there been any discussions to move this issue forward as, for example, Australia has with the ban of importation on these stronger lasers? As we see with the data, the increase in incidents will only continue. It's kind of like whack-a-mole. Most of these are made in North Asia, imported from there. Has there been discussions with other departments or other states?
So I alluded to this earlier. We're in the initial steps of launching that very process. So again, we don't have the regulatory authority to do that. So it's about working with Health Canada or potentially Public Safety, Department of Public Safety, who I suspect have the authority. So we recognize the issue. It's about making sure we enlist our other government department colleagues to address the issue. So short answer is yes. Initial steps.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, and the panelists for a great discussion on safety. Our motto at the Airline Pilots Association is schedule with safety, and I'm proud of a lot of things we do at ALPA, but I'm especially proud of the safety department we have, and we're always interested in everybody's views on safety and improving it, so thank you very much. Much enjoyed. Thank you.